The impact of World War I was enormous. Like, anti-colonial movements around the world are sparked, the entire Middle East gets reorganized, and the peace in Europe basically leads straight into World War II. But for the United States, World War I was also a similar turning point. For one, it established that the US could be a powerful military force if it really needed to be. And it definitely established the US as an economic powerhouse, fueling and funding the war effort from across the Atlantic. But as we'll see, for the most part, the US retreats back into its isolationist shell like as soon as the war is over. No more world wars for us, please and thank you. Woodrow Wilson, self-proclaimed global peacemaker, was a major force in the peace negotiations in Paris in 1919. It was there that he presented to the world his 14 points, a list of 14 rules for the world to prevent any future global conflicts. For the most part, they were ignored. Things like freedom of the seas and disarmament were adorable to imperial superpowers like Great Britain and France. One idea that caught the attention of oppressed people around the world and back at home was Wilson's principle of self-determination. Basically, he argued that the borders of countries should be decided by the people within those borders. You could probably guess, but this idea was really meant to be applied to white people, like Balkan nations like Serbia getting to determine their own future, that kind of thing. But colonized people all around the world also perked up. Gandhi was listening. Kwame Nkrumah was listening. Ho Chi Minh was listening. He was literally at the peace convention at the end of the war on behalf of French Indo-Chinese people in Vietnam. And women and minorities in the US were also listening. Self-determination, you say? W.E.B. Du Bois organized a Pan-African Congress held simultaneously in Paris to pressure the Allies to consider the status of people of color as they built the post-war world. I didn't really listen, but it's the last of the 14 points that was the most dramatic and ultimately the most embarrassing for Woodrow. He proposed a League of Nations with representatives from major countries to help preserve peace and protect each other's independence. Wilson spent months convincing Europe to join his new club. Well, except Germany, since they lost, and Russia, because they were communists now. But everyone else should join, woohoo! Except us. You see, the president doesn't actually have the power to declare war or make peace. That's Congress's job. Damn checks and balances. So Wilson had to take the treaties that he negotiated in Paris back to Congress, a Congress that was now controlled by Republicans. More specifically, a Congress that was controlled by Republicans who really were not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. Because Wilson had never been super keen on reaching across the aisle and working with the other side. He was the brilliant former president of Princeton, who had studied government and global peace treaties. Academics don't often handle criticism well, trust me. So Wilson didn't bring any Republican representatives with him to peace negotiations abroad, and many at home weren't super excited about joining a permanent alliance with European nations after they'd just been dragged into a world war they didn't really want to fight in the first place. So a group of congressional Republicans led by Henry Cabot Lodge were open to signing the treaty with some amendments, but Wilson refused to cave. Congress refused to pass Wilson's treaty twice, forcing Wilson to take his argument to the public. He went on a nationwide speaking tour, giving 39 speeches in 3 weeks across 8,000 miles, trying to convince the public to urge their senators to ratify the treaty. It didn't work. In fact, it went so poorly that it basically killed Wilson. No, really. Soon after the tour, he suffered a stroke, still refusing to compromise from his sickbed. After a second stroke, he was paralyzed on the left side of his body, although his mind was still sharp. But at this point, his second wife, Edith, stepped up and basically ran his office on his behalf. Those close to him knew how ill he was, but they said nothing as Edith covered up his condition to the public. She controlled who could speak directly with him and often wrote letters and directives with his signature. So, I mean, we've kind of already had our first female president. After Wilson's term ended a few months later, Congress ratified separate treaties with the Central Powers, and the League of Nations was formed without the United States, significantly weakening the group. And the post-war economy didn't fare much better. You see, putting in place all of those wartime controls and restrictions is fine, but then when you remove all of that oversight in one fell swoop, the economy takes some time to adjust. For example, when restrictions on what you could buy suddenly went away, people are going to rush to buy up the goods that had been rationed. And businesses are going to raise their prices that they had been forced to keep low. Yada, yada, yada. This led to rapid inflation. Also, a bunch of factories had shifted all of their production to wartime materials, knowing that they had a guaranteed customer in the US government. Now, orders for war materials were declining and they had to lay off their workers. Strikes swept the nation as the urban economy struggled. In 1919 alone, there were over 3,600 strikes involving 4 million workers, not to mention all of those returning soldiers who came home to find women and men of color in their jobs. Remember that in the Great Migration, African Americans had moved up north for jobs and hopefully better treatment, but when white soldiers returned home, they often blamed their economic problems on these new arrivals. Jobs were scarce, housing options were often limited, and the few Black veterans were returning home empowered to push more forcefully for equality. In the summer of 1919, race riots broke out across the nation, starting in Longview, Texas. Armed white mobs attacked Black parts of the town, burning homes and businesses and killing one Black man. It was only stopped after the National Guard and Texas Rangers took control of the city. No arrests of white men were made, and the Black men involved in some of the retaliatory actions were taken to Austin, supposedly for their own personal safety, but they were also taken away from their homes and families and warned and threatened to never return to Longview again. Throughout the so-called Red Summer of 1919, race riots erupted across 25 different cities, but arguably the worst violence was in Chicago. Violence broke out after a young Black man accidentally swam into an area of Lake Michigan that was for whites only. He was stoned and drowned, but police refused to make any arrests. Violence spread across the city for 13 days, resulting in the deaths of 15 white people and 23 Black people, hundreds injured, and over 1,000 Black families were made homeless. And the economic problems were just as bad in rural areas. The need for crops was so high during the war that many farmers bought up more land and took out loans to buy new farm equipment. Now, with inflation and a much smaller market, farmers were struggling to make ends meet, and they owed more and more money to the banks. At the same time, Black sharecroppers across the South were pushing for their own rights. In Elaine, Arkansas, Black sharecroppers tried to organize into a union inspired by the progressives in the cities. White mobs responded by massacring dozens or even hundreds of Black people in retaliation for this perceived attack on their socioeconomic well-being. In 1919 alone, there were 83 lynchings across the South, and 11 of those victims were Black soldiers returning from the war. This obviously led to disillusionment amongst Black Americans who felt like their contributions during the war had been for nothing. But still, many Black Americans saw an opportunity. The nation had just spent years discussing rights, self-determination, and nationalism. Women were finally gaining the right to vote, and the extreme violence and mistreatment of Black Americans, especially war veterans, provided an easy way to highlight the oppression that Black people had been experiencing for centuries. After the war, the young NAACP saw a surge in membership, and in 1919, during the Red Summer, they began a new campaign against lynching. Side note, Congress just passed the federal lynching legislation that the NAACP has been fighting for over a century. And to be clear, lynching was always a crime because it's murder, but the prosecution and punishment of perpetrators was left up to the states or even the local governments. So essentially no one was ever punished for lynching a Black person. The legislation the Black activists have been wanting for over 100 years that just passed Congress in 2022 makes lynching a federal hate crime, meaning that the federal government is the one to take control of the case, not the states. And all of this racial violence should also be understood in the context of our first Red Scare. The end of the 19th century saw the rise in new immigrants from places like Eastern and Southern Europe, plus a successful communist revolution in Russia in 1917, and now riots, strikes, and labor unrest across the country. During the Red Summer, as race riots erupted across the nation, a series of homemade bombs were being shipped to prominent Americans. In just 1 month, 30 packages with bombs inside were sent to business owners and politicians by a group of anarchists. At the same time, prominent socialist leader and presidential candidate was being put in jail for violating the Espionage Act. Later in the summer, 8 bombs exploded within minutes of each other across 8 cities, one of which damaged the home of the U.S. Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. And he was like, oh hell no. Palmer established a special division within his Justice Department that could root out enemies from within, known as the FBI. And this new division conducted a series of raids on union offices, especially unions representing foreign-born Americans. They deported 249 immigrants across 12 cities in just 1 month. They continued to raid various radical organizations, eventually arresting over 6,000 people. The Palmer raids entered homes without search warrants, jailed suspects indefinitely with no contact with an attorney, basic Bill of Rights kind of stuff. And most of the 600 immigrants who were eventually deported never had a court hearing. The effect of the so-called Palmer raids was that he became a national American hero, despite the fact that there was never any real evidence of a larger revolutionary conspiracy. But over 30 states passed their own sedition laws, making it illegal to join any group that advocated revolution. Bye-bye, Communist Party. And there were increasing calls to severely limit immigration. Spoiler alert, in a few episodes, I'm going to explain how these immigration restrictions are going to inadvertently lead to Pearl Harbor. Foreshadowing. Oh yeah, there's one more thing going on. There was a global pandemic. The 1918 flu pandemic is often incorrectly known as the Spanish flu because the first international reports of the illness came out of Spain, but it would actually be more accurate to call it the Kansas flu because we now know that the first reports of this flu came out of Fort Riley in Kansas. But the US press was being censored at the time, and the military definitely wasn't going to make a big press release about its soldiers getting some mysterious illness. The only reason we heard about it first from Spain was because the Spanish government wasn't involved in World War I, and so they weren't censoring its press. Good for you. And sorry that you got the whole pandemic named after you. So as far as we know, US soldiers carrying this stronger strain of the flu traveled to Europe. They fought alongside soldiers from literally all over the world in the trenches, where the flu spread rapidly and grew even stronger. And then the peace sent everyone back to their home countries. The global health crisis infected an estimated 1/3 of the world's population and resulted in at least 50 million deaths worldwide, including around 675,000 deaths in the United States. Cities imposed quarantines, closed schools and theaters, and mandated mask wearing. Sound familiar? Anyway, this was just one more disruption that caused a lot of Americans to just be like, over it. All of it. By the time the election of 1920 rolled around, people were just straight up exhausted. The Democrats ran a progressive ticket under James M. Cox and a relative newcomer as his VP named Franklin Roosevelt. But they were beat in a landslide by Republican Warren G. Harding, who captured the exhaustion and just general over-it attitude of white voters by calling for a return to normalcy. So the progressive era ended as many white Americans wanted to put their racial, labor, and economic troubles behind them. They just wanted a calm, quiet, definitely not roaring next decade. Oh man, I have some bad news for them. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.